So I want to talk to you about Charlie. Charlie was a foster dog of mine and he lived with me for quite a long time. He might have been one of my most challenging and long-term foster dogs. So his story was that when I first met Charlie, he was living in a home, and the person that had bought him as a puppy, clearly had perhaps some learning difficulties, which meant that they were not able to look after him and care for him in the way that we might have expected. So he was living in this person's back garden. They had got a crate for him, a training crate, and they put him in there. And pretty much that's where he stayed for the first 18 months of his life. He was fed in there. He toileted in there. He rarely came out for any reason. He was exposed to all the weathers. He never got exercise. He never really had a lot of company. Nobody ever really spent any time with him. So he was treated a little bit like like you might treat a rabbit in a cage almost. You know, he was left there. So 18 months later, I came and met him in the garden, and it had been very obvious to me that this lady was not coping with this dog and didn't know how to look after him. And I think we can agree that's probably a bit of an understatement. So I convinced her to let me take him home, and boy, had I underestimated how much work I was going to have to do with Charlie. I don't begrudge a minute of it, but this wasn't just a simple case of socialising him and then helping him find a new home. There were so many problems. For one, he hadn't been out of that cage in 18 months. So his feet weren't fit to walk on hard ground. So anytime I wanted to take him anywhere, his feet bled. The skin on the bottom of his feet just came right off, and they bled and bled. So there was lots of work to be done in terms of building him up to being outside and being on hard ground and going for walks. But that wasn't the biggest problem I had with him. Of course, he'd never really been for walks before. So when he left the garden and left the safety of that cage, which sadly he did see as his safety zone, and when I took him out of that cage and took him away from that home, he went purely straight into panic mode. He had no idea how to cope in the outside world. He didn't know what to do with other dogs, with kids, with men. The person that he was living with was a woman sort of in early retirement kind of age, maybe. Anything else other than that was brand new to Charlie. He'd never seen a grit bin, he'd never seen a wheelie bin, he'd never seen a car, he'd never seen any of these things. He didn't know what to do with them. This world suddenly became so overwhelming for him. And in the few moments it took for me to get him to the car, and when I talk about how I got him from that cage to the car, the only thing I can really compare it to would be trying to wrangle a crocodile from one place to another. My arms were bleeding. He completely panicked. He had no idea what to do. He was biting and scratching and jumping and all things. Well, I tried to get him away from there and get him into the car. I actually only lived a few minutes away, so this didn't have to last for too long for Charlie. I managed to get him home, and I managed to get him into my garden where it was safe and secure. And he was finally able to start to relax a little bit, because this was something he was used to, being outside in a garden. So that's really all I did with him for the first wee while. I had 2 dogs in the house as well. One of them was a foster and one was my own dog, Molly. I've talked about her quite a lot, my big Bernese mountain dog bear. I also had a son, and I had a husband at home that needed to meet Charlie. So this was all done very carefully and over quite a period of time, and Charlie really had no idea what to do. Thank goodness the dogs were patient with him. He made a lot of mistakes with them, but they were great with him, and he made really good friends with the Labrador that I was fostering at the time. So once he'd met everybody, I brought him into the house, and it was obvious he wasn't coping in there very well. So I introduced him to a dog crate, and I love dog training crates, and I encourage lots of people to use them. They're great tools for training. But it broke my heart to put Charlie in a crate, because he'd spent 18 months inside this crate. But once I put him back in the crate, he almost immediately started to sell. That was his safe place. He saw the world through bars. That's what he understood. So he felt calmer and safer in there. But that wasn't going to work for very long. So I had to spend time with him and gradually introducing him to the home, to noises, to mop buckets, to TVs, to microwave dings, to doorbell noises, just even his own feet on the floor in my living room. He didn't like the sound of the padding of his feet. It was quite an enormous task with Charlie, but our first step really was to let him get used to his home, know he was safe, and then after those first few days, we started working really, really hard with him. So we would bring him out of the crate, and he would come out basically until I felt like he was starting to not cope again. As soon as that anxiety level started to reach a point where it was starting to become maybe a little bit more noticeable, he was not interacting anymore, he was starting to maybe go quiet, he was starting to withdraw, I would put him back into his crate again for a little while. And gradually over time, he slowly spent more and more and more time out of the crate and started to look for comfort from me and from my other foster dog, Samson. So they bonded really well. Samson wasn't so keen, but he was very happy to have Charlie as his buddy. But Samson was quite a sort of a lonely dog. He would like to sleep by himself. He didn't like to be in contact with everything. He loved affection, he loved pets, he loved playing with dogs, he loved all that stuff. But when it came to lying down and sleeping, he really liked to be by himself. But he really tolerated Charlie coming over and snuggling right into him. So once we'd got Charlie much more used to being in the house and all of those noises, we could start taking him to walks in slightly more challenging places. I was quite lucky that often I would take my dogs to walk in a very quiet place. The place had been fenced off as a building site but never used, right close to where I lived. So that was a great place to take dogs. You never really saw anybody there, and they could just be free and relax and just enjoy their walks together and socialise and sniff and do all those normal things that they like to do. And Charlie was enjoying it there. I obviously didn't want to overwhelm him. On the first few weeks, with any rescue dog, you really have to take your time and you have to pick your battles. The first 3 days are just about getting used to your home and knowing that they're safe in your home and starting to realise who they're safe with. Then after that, then you can start to get to know them a bit more. They'll settle down and their behaviour will become, a little bit more normal as they start to realise what your routines are and what you do and who everybody's doing and things like that. The anxiety will start to reduce, and they'll spend a lot of the first 3 days maybe in sort of a fight or flight mode, and that will stop after that period of time. So they'll start to take more in, but still didn't want to overwhelm them too much. The house really was enough, and these little simple quiet walks were all that he needed at this very early stage. And it was good for his feet only to be walking for a few minutes at a time as well. So while that built up and while he got used to the house, those things kind of worked well together. So once he started to be used to the house, then I was able to start pushing him perhaps a little bit more on his walks and start introducing him to other dogs, going to different places and things like that. And actually did surprisingly well at that. He was very good at that, and he got very good at his lead. His recall was exceptional. He followed Samson everywhere he went, so he had no issues with his recall. So actually within a couple of months, I was actually able to let him off the lead, and he was able to go and play in the sea and run with Samson and chase balls and do all those things that he really loved. At the start, he also had quite a bit of separation anxiety. Even though he had the company of 2 other dogs, he didn't cope very well with being in the house on his own. And that was something I'd put on my to-do list with Charlie because, as I said at the start, you don't want to work too hard on everything. His behaviour will be quite changeable during those first few weeks because once he's got used to your routines and who does what around the house and what his role is in your home and all those other things, his behaviour can change quite a bit. So you don't want to work too hard on that, but obvious anxieties and things you can fix. But the rest of it, you need to give a bit of time. So even though in those first few weeks he did show a lot of signs of separation anxiety, he would chew things, he toileted in the house. Even though actually when people were there, he was very good. His house training actually came on really, really fast. He was such a smart dog. And the thing about Charlie was that he really just wanted to please everybody. And thank goodness, because he had that real keenness to learn and please and just be happy. And because of that, he was really easy to work with. So even though this has taken a period of quite a few months from when I got him, from when I felt like actually we were really making a lot of progress. It's actually really fast. A lot of dogs would be able to do that unless they had that real desire to please. And Charlie always reminded me of the dog from Up, Doug. He just kind of just wanted to please everybody and bounce around all the time, and whatever you would ask of him, you know, he would try, and he was always brave and tried to do things. And Charlie was exactly like him. So that was really a huge benefit. I guess it was also a little bit sad in a way as well, because I felt, you know, that if he had gone to a different home, I wondered what actually he could have achieved. I think he would have made an excellent search and rescue dog. He would have been brilliant at looking for people, and he also would have made a really good dog to go into hospitals and comfort people, maybe old people's homes or homes where people were sick, or, you know, that kind of thing. But he never got to that with me, and I think he probably could have done if he'd have started that kind of stuff when he was a bit younger and before a lot of these fears became problems for him. So anyway, so we were working with him out on his walk, and he was getting very good at meeting people and meeting dogs. And at first he would have been very reactive to anything at all, but as time went on, we worked with that reactivity and slowly were able to introduce him to other dogs and other people, and he realised actually that he could have a lot of fun when he was introduced with people and dogs. So at this stage then, we were working very closely on some very specific problems. In time, his separation anxiety actually went away once he managed to get settled in, and he realised he was safe and he was loved, and he worked out what our routines were like and what was happening. I was able then to start letting him have the full run of the house. I didn't want to keep putting him in his cage. He'd got very used to not being in his cage, and actually he was really good not in his cage. At first, his separation anxiety had come across through trying, chewing, destructive kinds of behaviours. But that, in time, had all started to clear up. And I'm a big advocate with rescue dogs where there's been abuse or neglect or something like that, or some trauma, is to really allow time to take its place and focus on being a good caregiver rather than specific problems. But there will come a time after all those weeks where you'll start to work on specific problems. And with Charlie, very specifically, he did not like anything new. So things like at Halloween, people would be putting decorations outside their homes. He didn't like that. If a shop put things outside the shop that he hadn't seen before, he didn't like that. So that was our focus there. And at home, we had one thing that we were working on, and that was the mop bucket. Whilst Charlie had managed to get used to most of the things in the house, all of the new noises, movements, cats as well I had, which he got used to those really quickly too, he had not got used to the mop bucket, and he was really suspicious of this mop bucket. I wondered actually at one point whether maybe this had come from being in a crate and having perhaps water, soapy water thrown, perhaps not at him intentionally, but by way of cleaning out the space, you know, that somebody would have sloshed it out with a bucket of soapy water, maybe. When it comes to rescue dogs, you often don't really know where they've come from and what they've had to put up with, what they've seen and what they've heard and treatments that they've had. But sometimes you can get a good idea by the way they react to certain things and so on. And this was a big reaction. It took a long time before we really started to focus in on it. But we'd worked on other things, and this was really the one thing that was left in the house that was really holding him back in the house. He wouldn't walk into a room if there was a mop bucket there. He wouldn't go past the doorway if he could see a mop bucket within the other room even. He wouldn't walk past. So it was quite debilitating for him if there was a mop bucket around, and I had hard floors, so it was not avoidable. So this was our mission, was to work on the mop bucket. And this took, the biggest thing it took was patience. And then the second biggest thing was a lot of treats. Charlie, thankfully, was very food motivated, but only motivated by dog food itself, by actual dry kibble. Charlie never really showed any interest in any other kind of food. And if I'd given the dogs a treat, maybe I'd give them a piece of garlic bread or a leftover Yorkshire pudding or something like that, he would ignore his and he wouldn't touch it. Even though he saw the other dogs eating theirs and enjoying them, you know, he never never really considered these things to be food. So for him, just food from his bowl, that's all he wanted, and he loved it, so that was fine. And it took so long to build up his confidence. First of all, to get him to walk past the door where you could see a mop bucket, then to get him to come and sit in the door while the mop bucket was visible. Slowly I would get him to come into the room and go to the furthest end of the room. Gradually we built this up more and more and more, got him closer and closer and closer to this mop bucket. We've done so well over a period of weeks. I managed to get him to the point where he would take treats from the edge of the mop bucket, that he would sniff it, that he would sniff the mop itself. And on this day, this was the day to get the mop out of the bucket and actually to start using it. And we'd come so far, and I was so proud of him. And he was sitting really beautifully beside me, just casually watching while I was mopping away with this mop. And it was fantastic, and I was so pleased with him. And I was chucking treats down for him, and he was looking for them. And he was really chilled and really happy until I'm mopping. The floor is wet. And I think probably you know where this is going by now. So I'm mopping away and I move across the floor, and the wet floor, of course, is slippery. And did I not just slip on this floor? And as I slipped, I kicked the bucket, and of course the water went everywhere. The bucket shot across the room, the mop went all over the place. I yelped, and Charlie scampered from the room. And at that moment I realised, when I'm lying on the floor and I can hear him whining in a different room, that at this point now, this mop bucket was probably never going to be Charlie's friend. I didn't think he was ever going to trust this bucket again. So that's the one thing I remember about Charlie. And we did get him built up so that he could be in the room while the bucket was there. And he could be near if the bucket was being used and the mop was being pushed around. But he would never have come close enough again to sniff it or stand beside it or anything like that. He preferred to stand in a doorway and just peek around nervously if there was any of that kind of stuff going on. So really from then on, I kind of cut my losses and thought, this is fine. If that's the only thing that Charlie's ever going to be scared of, then we have come such a long way, and I'm so proud of him. And that's where we stopped with Charlie. So Charlie had come from a dog that had never left a crate to one that was coping well. He could make friends. He could be in a home. He had doggy friends in the house. He met my cats. And he could very trusted wherever he was with the cats. He loved the cats. And, you know, by the time he went off to his new home, I was so, so proud of him. I had Charlie for quite a long time. That process there wasn't a process that took a couple of weeks. That took a couple of months. And the other dog I told you about, Samson, he was a foster dog as well. And eventually they both went off to a home together. They'd become really, really attached to each other. Charlie loved snuggling up with Samson, and in the end I don't think Samson would have had it any other way. So they both loved each other. They adored going for walks together. And they both lived a very happy ever after in another home. So I'm really pleased that they both had a really good, happy ending. But especially for Charlie, as he started off so badly and ended up coming on so, so well. Being a foster parent for a dog is probably like one of the hardest things that you do, because there's a big part of you that says the dog is for life. You don't take a dog on and then give up on them. And it's never giving up, of course, but there is an expectation that they won't stay with you forever, unlike another dog that you might adopt and that you might keep forever. So whenever they go to their new home, it's such a mixture bag of feelings. You're anxious because you don't know how they're going to get on. You've done all your checks, you've done everything you need to do, all the introductions, but you're still anxious for them. You want them to have a really good life, but you're sad as well because you've put so much work into them. And, you know, it doesn't take very long to fall in love with a foster dog or a rescue dog or any dog. You know, within 5 minutes of them coming into the house, they're there, they're yours, and they're stuck in your heart, and they always are. So, especially with a dog like Charlie, to say goodbye to them and let them go off and have the rest of their life is just heartbreaking, but it's so worth it because you get to then do it again with somebody else. So that was Charlie's story. I guess the thing that I was the most cross about the story, of course, he'd come from a home where he'd been neglected by that that lady, and that wasn't her fault. And I really felt in that situation that the breeder had a lot to answer for. Any breeder that breeds puppies and sells them to people must make sure that they're giving them to a good home. They have to make sure that the person that's taking them is capable of looking after a dog properly. Not just looking after them physically, although she wasn't managing with that either, but also look after their mental health, their training, you know, all of that kind of stuff. Too many times I see dogs that have been given to people that aren't ready for a dog, that don't know how to look after a dog. And we've all been there. None of us were born knowing how to look after a dog, but breeders do have a responsibility to make sure that that person is able to learn and knows enough about looking after a dog that they'll be able to give their puppies a good home. But that's my rant over, and that's Charlie's story. Thank you for listening. I went on a bit longer than I hoped to, but I'll speak to you again soon. Take care for now. Bye bye.